Greeny felt the slightly warm dirt beneath his feet jump slightly as he hit the ground from the wall. He wanted to get to the boss's tent quicker so he could get back to his boring shift and get it over with sooner, and if that meant jumping from the wall and risking his legs, then that was an alright trade in his eyes. He then began to walk at a decent pace, wincing slightly as his legs protested from the fall. Okay, so maybe not the best trade. He continued walking towards the tent, the sounds of the other residents being busy surrounding him as he made his way over. However, he stopped with a slight wince as he heard his name being called.
Greeny!
A voice called out, younger than his and filled with excitement. God, he hated that name. It wasn't even his actual name. It just so happened that he wore a lot of things that were green, had green eyes, and a green stripe that ran across his forehead because some kid thought it would be funny to do it. And he still couldn't get it off. Regardless, he turned to the voice in question, finding the small form of a child younger than him running over. With a sigh, he smiled and waved at the small boy.
Heya, Nev!
Nev was one of the youngest kids in the village, being only 7, and one of the more recent members that joined. He had come with his older sister, Jess, who was currently watching the wall and girl for him. He was quite an ordinary kid, all things considered. Brown hair, blue eyes, a face that was young, with a little button nose and chubby cheeks, constantly asking everyone about everything, and generally being a little rascal. He got on some people's nerves, even his, but he still found the boy endearing.
What you doing, huh? Something important? Something exciting?
Nev asked, his little hands shaking with excitement. Greeny merely shook his head at the young boy.
Nah, just checking in with management,
He stated, tilting his head at the gate.
Got a new person at the gate.
Despite how boring it would have sounded to any other person, Nev simply became more excited, releasing an
Ooh,
of curiosity.
a new person?
He asked.
Are they cool looking? Do they have a cool hat or jacket like the boss?
Greeny turned his head to look at the gate, a contemplative look taking over his face as he thought about the girl. 6, was it? There was something off about her. He didn't know what, though. The girl had approached the gate almost silently, and if it weren't for the raincoat she was wearing, he might not have known she was there. That was something that seemed off. The raincoat. The coat had clearly been for someone of a smaller stature than the girl, yet she still seemed to wear it, though not without consequence. The raincoat had clearly seen modification to make it fit her. The edge of the coat had bits of similar material sewn on to increase its size, yet not all the materials matched, resulting in a patchwork of blues, reds, and greens clashing violently together. Even the hood of the coat didn't seem like the intended one, as he had made out the stitch lines around it when he talked to her. The hood had also blocked much of her face, leaving only her mouth and black bangs to be seen. Talking to her hadn't revealed anything either, only that she seemed completely disinterested in talking to him, and only interested in getting the things she wanted. Overall, she seemed completely mysterious and cold. Wouldn't be the first person like that to cross through here. But still, there was something more to her.
Greeny?
Nev asked, confused, breaking him out of his little thought bubble.
They're different. I'll give them that.
He finally said, not wanting to explain too much to the younger boy. Nev simply stared for a couple seconds, before returning to his excited self.
They must be cool then if you're saying that. Sure.
He said sarcastically, patting the boy's head before moving past him, something which annoyed him slightly. But still, the boy smiled and waved him goodbye, and Greeny merely gave a single wave in response, without looking. He continued walking to the tent, increasing his pace slightly to make up for the lost time he spent talking to Nev. Eventually, the tent came into view, its cloth-like exterior juxtaposed with the cliff it was set up against. He made his way up to the tent, climbing the few stairs made from rock that led up to it before pulling the curtain back and sticking his head in. The interior was dimly lit, the only light sources being a lamp hung overhead and a candle lit on the boss's desk, which was currently occupied by the boss himself. He was sat down, his form hung over the desk, made from a long piece of wood balanced on 2 buckets and a cloth flung over it. Greeny could make out the sound of a pencil being used as he wrote something, more than likely orders for the other guards. Greeny cleared his throat, the sound getting the boss to stop writing, but not look up from his desk.
Hey, ya boss, know where management is?
He asked, the word management coming out of his mouth like raw sewage. The boss simply replied by pointing sharply at the other desk in the corner that was lazily slanted and currently occupied. He uttered a quiet
Thank you.
before entering the tent and making his way over to the desk in question, taking care to avoid the other figure in the room who was stood next to the boss's desk. Once he reached the desk, he placed a hand on his hip as he looked at management. God, he wondered how he managed to make people call him that. Management was a boy called Ozzy, a boy who was simultaneously both the smartest person in the village and the laziest. He was 2 years older than Greeny. His face was very angular, along with long blonde hair that always seemed to glow, and hazelnut eyes that always seemed to be filled with nothing but boredom. Currently, he was doing what he always seemed to be doing: sleeping. His feet were propped on the desk and his head balanced on his shoulder, whilst his arms hung like he was dead. Greeny shook his head at the sight. How this guy managed to organize everything around here whilst being asleep half the time baffled him. Then again, maybe that was why he was the head of organizing everything, because he was so lazy he found the most efficient way to do it. Greeny paused at that thought. Nah, he was just lazy. So, with that in mind, Greeny woke him up the only way he ever did, by pulling his chair back so that he lost balance. Immediately, Ozzy's eyes flung open as his legs flailed themselves around for a bit before they found the floor again. He flicked his head around before his eyes fell onto Greeny, and his slightly panicked gaze lessened into a look that was both equally annoyed and tired.
I think I told you not to do that before.
Ozzy stated, his voice easily conveying his annoyance. Greeny merely rolled his eyes.
And I'm pretty sure Allie told you not to fall asleep while she was present.
He stated, nodding his head to the figure standing over the boss's desk. Ozzy merely gave a lazy smile.
Relax. I told her I ain't got much to do today, so she let me have a rest for a bit.
Well, then I'm sorry to interrupt your beauty nap,
He said sarcastically.
but unfortunately, I got something for you to do.
Ozzy rolled his eyes and waved his hand nonchalantly for him to continue.
Got a new person at the gate. Need you to double check and log them in.
He said, leaning himself onto the desk slightly.
Right.
Ozzy replied lazily, leaning onto his desk to sort through some of the papers lazily strewn about before grabbing one that was apparently the right one and grabbing an incredibly short pencil.
Name?
He asked, propping his feet back upon the desk.
6.
Immediately upon uttering the girl's name, the atmosphere seemed to change as the telltale sound of a pencil snapping was heard. Greeny turned his head to the sound, finding it to be the boss's pencil that had snapped in two in his grip. And said boss was staring right at him, his eyes boring into him with a look he had never seen before.
Boss?
He asked, both concerned and confused, whilst out of the corner of his eye he could see that Ozzy was just as confused. The boss merely stood up from his desk, his form towering over Greeny as he approached.
Where did you hear that name, Greeny?
He asked, his voice low and filled with barely contained anger that he had never heard before. The question snapped him out of his stupor as he replied.
From the girl at the gate, boss. She said she was looking for supplies.
He stuttered slightly from the tone of voice he had never heard before, compared to the usual friendly voice he had.
And what did she look like?
His boss further probed, lowering himself slightly so he could look directly at Greeny. Greeny fidgeted his feet slightly as he responded.
She looked about as old as Allie, boss. Black hair and a bright yellow raincoat that looked stitched together and too small for her.
The boss seemed to devour his words as something flashed across his eyes. He straightened to his full height again, his gaze turning to the tent entrance as he clenched his knuckles hard enough for Greeny to hear them crack under pressure. Eventually, Allie came over from her usual place and laid a hand on the boss's shoulder. Saying nothing, yet Greeny could tell she was greatly concerned. The action caused his boss to stiffen slightly before looking at Allie and releasing a deep breath that sounded annoyed. There was a brief pause in the room as nobody did anything, only broken by the sound of the boss cracking his jaw. He then turned to Greeny, his more composed state returning as he placed his hands behind his back.
Let them in, Greeny, but bring them straight to my tent.
He ordered before turning his head to look at Allie.
You go with him as well, Allie.
Allie herself tilted her head slightly in confusion at his order, but said nothing of it, instead walking over to the tent entrance to wait for Greeny. At this, Greeny flashed his boss a thumbs up and went to go join Allie. However, as he returned, he felt his boss's hand lay itself on his shoulder.
Be careful and keep an eye on her. She's dangerous.
The words were spoken quietly, yet the same protectiveness he always spoke with was even more prevalent. Greeny merely nodded without looking, instead walking to the tent entrance and stepping out, the sound of Allie's footsteps following closely behind. As he walked back to the gate, he only had one thought. Just who was this girl?
But does he listen to what I say? No. Instead he goes...
Six had begun to tune out the girl a few minutes ago. Trying her best not to interact with the girl had clearly not worked, as she didn't seem to understand that she wasn't interested at all. Instead, the girl had begun to blather on about her younger brother who constantly got into trouble, and the other kid, Greeny, was it, who apparently looked after them sometimes? Six hadn't the faintest idea. Now, she stared into space as the girl kept talking, completely ignorant of Six. That was until a voice called out her name. The action caused Six to snap to attention as she turned her gaze to the girl up top. The girl was clearly talking to someone below her, yet the distance between them made it nearly impossible for Six to hear them, only catching on to the words of boss, gate, and tent. Then, the girl took a single glance back at Six before disappearing from sight behind the wall. Six stood for a few seconds waiting, before the sound of latches and bolts being undone was heard. The gate then creaked and groaned as they were pulled open, and the inside of the village was exposed. The boy from before came into view once more, a fake smile on his face as he welcomed Six inside with a gesture.
Welcome to New Dream Village.
Six stepped inside, taking in the sight of the village as the gate doors closed behind her. The village was made up of tents and wooden structures that stretched as far as the wall could allow, stacked shoulder to shoulder, and some of them on top of each other. Each one was unique, a different design from the last, some more sturdy looking than others, different woods and cloths used to build the makeshift huts that the residents called home. Yet there were 3 structures that stood out to Six. The first was a hut built bigger than the others, that rested on what Six assumed was the eastern side of the wall. The outside of it was colored differently to the rest, marked with whites and reds, a cross made of crimson, and symbols that indicated medicine and care. It was built sturdier as well, the majority of it being made of what appeared to be metal and wood, more correctly placed. The second structure on the western side was one that actually gave Six pause, in both its placement and the rarity of it. It was a shed. Not just any shed, though. An adult shed. It was bigger than the one that the hunter had stored a spare gun in all that time ago, and had clearly seen better days, but it still stood thanks to what appeared to be shoddy repairs with random pieces of timber. The shed's door was clearly open, a few children entering and exiting, moving what appeared to be sacks of food and supplies in and out of the shed. The window of the shed was also clearly smashed some time ago, the front of it now having a platform that currently housed a guard that stood watch over the door. It was very rare for children to take residence inside adult structures, even as small as a shed, so it surprised her that it was done here. Though it did make her question why exactly there was a shed out here when there was apparently no home to speak of. Regardless, she turned her gaze away from it to the last structure. The third thing wasn't a structure, not really anyway. Instead, it was a statue situated nearly in the center of the village that was made of stone. Even from where she stood, Six could make out that the statue was of shoddy craftsmanship, though that was to be expected of what was more than likely kids attempting to carve stone. But still, she could make out what it resembled. 2 hands, fingers interlocked in a firm grasp that ensured neither would part from the other, a sign of trust and friendship to enable strength to face the world. Six felt like snorting at that. It hadn't worked for her, had it? Satisfied with her observations, Six made to move further into the village to find this Artie the boy had talked about. But she was stopped by a hand on her shoulder and a calm but commanding,
Hey.
She turned her head quickly to whoever had placed a hand on her, finding it to be the boy from before. As much as Six wanted to physically slap the hand and boy away from her, she knew it wasn't a great idea, instead choosing to shrug his hand off and affix him with a glare. The boy, Greeny, she remembered, merely placed his hand back to his side.
I know you're wanting to get your supplies and leave, but there's something you need to do first.
Six lifted an eyebrow under her hood. He gestured to something to her right with a thumb.
The boss wants to see you first before you do anything. Don't know what about, though.
He stated to her, though the last part was muttered more to himself, seemingly. Six narrowed her eyes at what the boy said. What did the supposed leader of this place want with her? She didn't like it. It felt like a trap or something else was going to happen.
And if I refuse?
She asked, wanting to see what would happen.
Then you can leave.
A new voice stated behind her, that of a girl's that sounded no nonsense in every capacity. Six turned to the new voice to indeed find a new girl behind her. She was about the same age as her, dark skin, long black hair tied back into several braids, and dark brown eyes that looked hardened and prepared for anything. The girl wore armor like the rest, but it appeared to be made mainly of bone compared to the others, the most defining piece of it being a large bird skull that resembled a hawk being tied over her shoulder. The girl also appeared to have a large sword of some kind that appeared handmade strapped to her back, ready to be drawn. The girl's face was currently giving Six a look that screamed, "Try anything and see what happens," that would have intimidated others. Six could care less, however. She had seen it before. But she still needed those supplies, and despite how much this felt like a trap, she would unfortunately have to comply. So, with a silent huff of regret, Six turned her gaze back to the boy and gave him a nod to indicate she would follow. The boy nodded back and began to walk, Six silently following behind him, with the girl's footsteps following her quickly after. She took in more of the village as they walked to wherever they were taking her, seeing more huts and children moving around, some working, some playing, but it left Six with a question that she wanted answered.
How many kids live here?
She asked, her question directed at the boy. He glanced back for a second, a look of confusion on his face, though it didn't last long as he looked forward again.
Last time I checked, there were over 100 kids living here, though I'm not so sure since I'm not someone who keeps count.
He answered, a bit of uncertainty in his voice. Six said nothing, instead silently digesting the new information. If what the boy said was true, then this was the biggest village she had ever been to. That also meant if any trouble happened, she would have a harder time than she thought. They kept walking in silence as Six continued her observations, making a mental escape path in her head in case things went south. They passed the statue that stood in the center, and as they did, Six noticed something about it. The two interlocked hands that stood slightly taller than Six were covered in small handprints, clearly from children who had dipped their hands in paint. The girl behind her noticed her stare at the statue and spoke up.
If you're wondering, the handprints are from every child that has lived here, past and present.
She stated, her voice slightly sorrowful at that last part. Six couldn't tell, and truth to be told, didn't really care. They continued onwards until a large tent, bigger than the rest that littered the village, came into view, propped up against the cliff face and stood on a rocky outcrop that had a few steps leading up to it. The boy turned around as they reached the tent curtains and gave Six a nod towards them.
The boss is inside,
He said with a flick of his thumb.
He's a bit high-strung at the moment, so please don't be disrespectful to him. He's dealing with a lot of stuff at the moment.
He added quickly afterwards, putting a lot of stress into his words to get them across. He really didn't want to be putting more stress on the boss. He was dealing with a lot already, especially with the recent adults patrolling nearby, causing a lot of grief for them. Even if it was the boss who wanted this girl brought to him. Six merely let out an unamused huff and shoved herself right past the boy, causing both him and the girl to let out sounds of annoyance and panic. If this boss didn't want any disrespect when he was dealing with other things, then he shouldn't have wasted her time by bringing her to meet him. The curtains parted as she entered the tent, her eyes readjusting to the low light level of the tent. Then everything stopped, as her eyes locked onto the back of what she assumed was the boss. But that wasn't who he was to her. She didn't register the presence of two more bodies standing behind her, their voices drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming presence of who stood before her. He finally noticed their presence, slowly turning around to reveal himself. And as soon as he did, his eyes immediately locked onto hers. Likewise, so did hers. It didn't matter that he'd grown taller. It didn't matter that his clothes had changed slightly, and it definitely didn't matter that his face was covered. Because that was how she knew him. When his eyes locked onto hers, there was a brief moment, very brief, where they were filled with shock, as if they couldn't believe what was before them. But that faded quickly, instead replaced by resentment and hatred that she expected. Hands behind back, drawn to full height, the former friend before her opened his mouth behind his mask and spoke the first words to her in 7 years.
6.
His voice was older, deeper to be sure, but behind it all was still the same voice she had known, now filled with bitter anger. And she repaid in kind, for she had not forgotten either.
Mono.
Her voice was low, a whisper that spoke of her anger towards him. They stood before each other, neither moving nor seemingly breathing, the tension in the air palpable. Meanwhile, the 3 other occupants in the tent watched on, only one thing on their minds. What the hell was going on?